That's right.
8 till 12, 20, and then meeting. And then
Writing
running
is
over here. Yeah.
Oh, there's, more chairs over
So
here.
Fred, they're gonna put you at the end of the event on that day, so you can come.
You have to everybody leaves.
Out of my seat here.
They told me to tell you between 12
Oh, are you doing the camera?
midnight and 1
I'm doing
a.m.
everything. I'm a jack of all trades.
Thank you.
There won't be anybody opposed to your award. Yeah. Just like later in the afternoon.
About 3:30-ish.
Yeah, whatever that is.
Right,
So you can,
right.
you know, once you get there, you won't be mentioned until toward the end.
The other Melissa.
Yes.
She's upstairs. She's on her way down. Introduce her.
Are you guys ready to?
My superstar is here.
Hello,
Hi, Fred.
how are you doing?
I'm good.
I'm sure we need help.
Personnel.
Yeah, we're leaving from my office.
You have to make good use of time. Eat and listen at the same time, or at least eat.
Well, sure.
Pretty
Yeah,
much you
I brought my
are.
lunch with me and
Here we go.
I was actually working upstairs all morning. It was fun. Well, I had a doctor's appointment and I would have made campus at about 10 and I thought, well, why don't I just come here?
This is exciting.
Let me interrupt you.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am delighted that you are all here. My name is Bill Zahner. I am the Associate Director of CRMSE, the Center for Research in Mathematics and Science Education. And we are very excited to welcome our guests today, Saul and Melissa, who are going to be presenting on their research, cultivating English language learners' competence in mathematics and science. Saul is a faculty member in the DLE department in the College of Education. I have to think as I say that because I was going to say School of Teacher Education. That's incorrect, and I'll be thrown out the door. And Melissa is a doctoral student in the joint doctoral program. A little bit of background from them. Saul grew up, or is from Pasadena, where he was a high school teacher, and taught in Northwest Pasadena, as I was corrected, and is a Dodgers fan. We'll just leave it at that.
Yes.
And Melissa originally is from Tijuana and is taught 4th and 8th grade, and is now also teaching in our DLE department. So we are delighted to have you both here, and we are very excited for your presentation. So,
Thank you.
oh, and I should say a really important thing. Saul is also a fellow banana slug.
Yeah.
For 1 year or 2 years?
I don't know.
I can't remember either. It was so long ago in Santa Cruz. So, welcome. Great to
Gracias,
see you.
Bill. Buenas tardes, good afternoon. Thank you all so much for making time in your busy schedules to spend some moments with us. We appreciate it. My name is Saul Maldonado, and I am a faculty member over at DLE, the Dual Language and English Learner Education Department. I'm also a research associate for JBS International. The California office is in Burlingame, and the principal strand of my research looks at how policies and practices impact minority students' K through 12 achievement, and I have a particular focus on mathematics.
Okay, so bienvenidos, welcome. As you heard, my name is Melissa Navarro, and I've been teaching for 3 years in the Department of Dual Language and English Learner Education. I teach science methods for multiple subjects in Spanish, and my research is focused on improving the experiences of English learners at the elementary school level, and the way that I'm attacking this, or the angle that I'm coming at, is in teacher preparation, so dual language teacher preparation.
Before we continue, I'd like to add a quick note about the word cultivating in our title. I find the guiding metaphor of el árbol, the tree, in the 2016 text, Growing Critically Conscious Teachers, extremely relevant to my work as a teacher educator. I think all the conversations that I participate in are like seeds, and these seeds with the right conditions, or the appropriate conditions, they can become trees, but I think it's very important to be explicit that trees take time, and that the type of work that we're doing is not a quick fix solution. And And that's just an appropriate metaphor for me. It comes out of that book. We have resources for you to take with you after our talk, if you'd like. Ask Melissa to continue.
Okay.
Oh. So I'm honored to be here at CRMSE. So congratulations on your 30 years of work and being in this space. I also want to take a moment to thank Karen Palmer, Bill Zahner for organizing and coordinating this conversation with you all today. Lots of emails back and forth. And your center's impact and influence on math and science education is indisputable. We can point to folks like Melissa Soto, who's our superstar here, has offered us guidance regarding formative assessment tools to document and evaluate students' thinking for making more meaningful instructional practice choices. Bill Zahner has given us multi-leveled analyses of discursive reasoning in the context of 9th grade bilingual students in algebra. And Randy Phillip and colleagues have stated that beliefs are not all or nothing entities, and when faced with challenging decisions, which often are made spontaneously, teachers are often compelled by their beliefs in very particular ways. So I did want to make sure I express my gratitude to some of these folks that have been influencing our work. And Colega, why are you interested in cultivating English learners' competence in math and science?
Before we go into that, I just wanted to highlight our science education, what we know about science education. And so to point out some of the amazing work that's come out of here, us, right? And so Donna Ross and Nancy Frey remind us about the importance of integrating science and literacy. And Alberto Rodriguez talks about making pedagogy and curriculum socially and culturally relevant when he talks about social transformative constructivism. And we also have the work that adapting real life problem lessons to include engineering and design. And so we have an example from someone in our department that's developed a 2nd grade lesson, and why reinvent the wheel? We have all these lessons already created. We can just add the engineering design part to it, so we don't have to start over. Okay, so why am I interested in cultivating English learners? Okay, so as a 13-year-old, when I came to the country, it was my 2nd year in the country. And for math, forget the fact that I was placed in a track that was looking at place value. My teacher didn't know how to work with me, so he had me sitting in the back of the room coloring. Okay, so, and then I clearly remember him telling me tenths. And I thought 10 because I couldn't hear the TH at the end. So these are some of the experiences that have pushed me to want to see why is it that he couldn't help me? And then even learning about, he had a Hispanic last name, why doesn't he speak Spanish? So it was my experiences as a student, and it was my experiences as a 4th grade and 8th grade dual language teacher that have been motivating me to continue trying to investigate what are the best ways to prepare teachers, what are the best ways to work with English learners. So that's about me. What about you? What are some of the things that motivate you to do this kind of research?
I'm glad you bring up the word motivation, because we all have particular motivations for why we do this work. I was a public high school teacher in Pasadena, as Bill already mentioned. My classroom was the after-school study space for the Upward Bound students. Upward Bound is a federal project that is designated for students from low-income families to prepare for college. I realized that in my classroom that Upward Bound students needed more support in learning mathematics. That's what all the conversation was about. How can I improve my mathematics every day for multiple years? So fast forward a few years and I become an Upward Bound director, and that concern is still there and it's present every day. The more advanced classes that my students take in math and science, the more collegiate opportunities that they have in their transition post-high school. So I've been doing this work for a while, and I think it's also important to note that additionally I was an English language learner. So these are some of the motivations that bring me to this work. Can you talk a little bit about the policy context in which we find ourselves today in 2017?
Yeah, so I didn't know when I came into the country that there was something called dual language, and CVLCC was right around the corner from where I lived. And so now with Proposition 58 passing and making multilingual education legal, right? So now it's like, what are we going to do now to get all these bilingual certified teachers who were not able to teach in the dual language or bilingual context? What are we going to do with them to make sure that they feel ready and prepared and they are able and capable to teach English language learners? And then also being cautious about the fact that we don't want to just spread dual language programs like popcorn, right? It's a process and we need to be ready. That's the whole program structure.
And I want to add to that a little bit that we find ourselves in the next generation and Common Core state standards movement, and policies like this come and go, usually around every 10 to 15 years. So how can we be in the moment and simultaneously create sustainable practices beyond this particular era, this particular policy context? Currently, I'll cite the work of some folks that have looked at some of the cross-cutting knowledge and skills. Specifically, I'll reference folks at Understanding Language and Scale that do this work. And specifically in mathematics, I'm very interested in what conceptual understanding means. So if you haven't seen that branch, I'm sure everyone in that room, that tree with all the branches of what mathematics competence means, I'm just particularly interested in that conceptual understanding piece in the work that I do. So next, I'd like to just give a brief overview of some of the structure that we have in this talk, and additional slides are on the front table if you don't have a slide. But I want to share this framework with you all. I'll start with the Understanding Language folks, Lee, Quinn, and Valdez. They remind us that English language learners require adequate support to do specific things with language, both in their content area learning and also in their English language and literacy development. So what are those very particular things? And that's kind of where we'd like to take our conversation today. And then when we think about assessment, all our professional organizations remind us that whenever we have any assessment, whether it's formative or whether it's summative, it's not just an assessment of the content, but it's also an assessment of the language in which that content is presented. So being very mindful of this duality in the assessment and calculating that variance is important to us. And then drawing on the work of opportunities to learn that particular framework is important for our work, but I'll listen to a little bit about that.
Okay, so in quoting Juan Gilmore, 2007, and analyzing I always forget if it's Cassie or Casey, but the California high school exit exams.
It's either.
Okay, well, I'm just going to take whatever you want. In probability, an event is a particular happening that may or may not occur. Okay. So this finds a comprehension of the items that STEM requires students' proficiency in specialized meanings, conditional statements, and relative clauses.
And in addition to that, we also have to be mindful of cultural context clues. So Jo Holder gives an example in one of her texts where she writes that in a Sat 9 statement, a cable crew had 120 feet of cable left on a 1,000-foot spool after wiring 4 identical new homes. First of all, you have to know what electricians' practices are. Then you have to be familiar with the context of a spool. And so being mindful of those realities is important. So how do we account for these realities? So drawing on the work of Opportunity to Learn, we're going to present just a brief overview about this framework and how it's informed our thinking along the way.
Okay, and then another dimension to consider is that although assessment results are used as markers of content area knowledge and skills, I'm actually going to read this one because I read this one. Where am I? Such as personal characteristics and contextual experiences are often ignored. And so with Opportunities to Learn, there's a few questions that are guiding us to conceptualize a pathway to account for the interactive interplay amongst content taught, resource allocation, and technical practices. So some of the questions that we're looking at here is to ask ourselves, Did students have appropriate exposure to the content evaluated on the assessment? Right, so exposing students to content. To what extent did the teacher cover the content deeply? Did the teacher follow research-based learning materials with fidelity? And to what extent is the teacher qualified to teach the content? Are they credentialed? Did they participate in advanced coursework in the content? Did students have access to the appropriate instructional tools, such as supportive technology? Did students learn in an environment with appropriate physical resources? And what values do educators place on specific instructional practices? So OTL questions are complementary to interpreting assessment results.
And teacher perceptions allow us a little glimpse as to what values our colleagues and ourselves we bring to this type of work. So my colega Melissa, along with Cristina Navarro and Lilia Bartolome and Ana Hernandez, they've been doing this work for quite some time. They've been looking at how do bilingual educators' knowledge, dispositions, and skills give us some insight into teachers' socio-political, ideological, cultural, and linguistic values. So can you give us just a brief highlight of that work that you did?
Yeah, so I don't know if you've heard, or 6 years ago we started Project Core, which was professional development for teachers in implementing the Common Core state standards and the ELD standards with students who were English learners. And I think some of you were there for the first year, which was the faculty syllabus revision portion, and there was a stipend for that. The following year we added the in-service component, so we invited teachers to come in to get a certificate, whether it was ELD or dual language. And then the next piece was having institutes for our pre-service teachers, so once a month on Fridays when they were not student teaching, they got to come and spend time with us the whole day. And we brought people from the county office, so this was a collaboration with county offices, local districts, and San Diego State University. And currently what we're doing is that we are gathering together in spaces such as CABE, NAVE, La Cosecha, which are all bilingual education and dual language settings, where we're meeting to develop the standards for preparing dual language teachers. So that's what we're working on right now.
And one of the folks who's actually working on this national initiative just walked in. Dr. Sara Hernandez is developing these national standards for teacher preparation in bilingual context. And as we move forward, we just want to briefly overview. So this is the work we've done. This is the progression, but we draw very particular frameworks in the work that we've been doing. So yes, knowledge, dispositions, and skills, and yes, OTL, and also other frameworks like Rochelle Gutierrez's work, and then pass the knowledge. Start with that.
Okay, so in a few slides where I'm going to go over one of the studies that I conducted, but it's pretty much using Austin's input, environment, output model, which is originally intended for higher education, but I adapted it and I've been using it with teacher preparation and with students at the elementary school level. So in thinking about English learners, what are they bringing, right? So from their home countries or from their families, communities, what are they bringing? What are we providing them with in the school setting? So what can we do so that they, whatever output we're expecting from them, so they can get there. So that's the idea behind Austin's model.
And Rochelle Gutierrez's work, we have these two axes, the dominant one and the critical mathematics one. We talk a lot about access and achievement, but we talk less so about identity and power and what that means. Gutierrez defines dominant mathematics as the practices that reflect the status quo in society, what gets valued in high-stakes testing and credentialing, that privileges a static formalism in mathematics, and that is involved in making sense of a world that favors the views and perspectives of a relatively elite group. Critical mathematics is defined by Rochelle as the practices that acknowledge students as members of a society rife with all kinds of issues of identity and power at all times. So with this type of framework, we can look at how do students see themselves and their future, and simultaneously look at teachers' instructional practices. So these axes are distinctive, but they're synergistic, and that's how Rochelle would present this. One of the ways I've heard Rochelle talk about it is that mathematics, the discipline, needs the students, for sure. Just as much as students need the mathematics. But oftentimes we don't see that the legacy and the continuation of our disciplines requires particular individuals. And Rochelle would also add this notion of Nepantla in the middle. And Nepantla is a Nahuatl word that would mean in the middle of it, or middle, if you will, sort of that intersection. And it's about describing the multiple realities that foster transformation. And so while we're negotiating access and achievement in a status quo way, how are we simultaneously working towards winning the game and changing the game simultaneously? That's how Rochelle would particularly use it. And I just want to take a quick aside to thank CRMSE for allowing me the opportunity to meet Rochelle Gutierrez last year when she came to this talk. She came and provided a talk, and that was just one more highlight of the work that you all are doing.
Okay, and then for this, our other framework is Tara Yoso's Community Cultural Wealth, that even though it came out in 2005, has had a huge impact, at least in my life, the work that I do, understanding where I'm coming from, my students are coming from, and where I want to move to from now on. And so she uses this idea of income, not income, but wealth. So what is the wealth that the students bring? What is this accumulated set of assets, cultural assets that students are bringing into the classrooms, into the schools, into the communities, and how can we use that to help them, not us, move forward, right? And so she actually challenged Pierre Bourdieu's theories, and she challenged critical race theory as well, and said there's still something missing. So these are the 6 different capitals that she came up with to help us move forward. So there's cultural capital, aspirational capital. A lot of times people, or not people, in research we see that there's like, oh, well, students aren't doing well because they don't want to, or they're not interested. But there's research that shows that parents have the aspiration, children have the same aspiration as other peers that are not necessarily on the same socioeconomic level. Familial capital goes into that too, social capital, career, day, things like that. Navigational capital, resistant capital, and mainly for my research, linguistic capital. So how do we use the students' language to make sure that we're addressing that in the classrooms and the work that we do?
And which students are we talking about? We're talking about English language learners today, and there are almost 5 million English language learners in the United States schools today. And if we analyze trends, we can estimate 15, 20, 25 years from now, we're going to be talking about 25% of our school-age population. And we see that reality already here in the state of California. So we know that most of our ELLs are in primary schools, and we know that we have less ELLs in the secondary context. And I'd like us to think a little bit about that. It's not necessarily always that it's just because they've acquired the English language. Sometimes, if we look at the work of Lori Olson and folks in California together that specify their lens on long-term English learners, sometimes it's because there have been policy disconnections. When we think about high-stakes exit exams in the secondary context, and we know that that is going to be in the English language, we're essentially making a decision that for these students, it's okay for them to disconnect because they will not receive that high school diploma at the end. So we have extra copies of Lori Olson's Repairable Harm Report if you're interested in that. And in the past, I've used slides in the work that look at achievement trends between English learners and non-English learners. I've done that for many years now, where we know in these slides that English language learners are going to score in a disparate fashion, underperform relative to non-ELLs. And every interaction, every conversation allows me a small glimpse to reflect on our drive home and so on. And in a previous presentation, I'm no longer interested in participating in as much as possible in participating in deficit discourses of what English language learners do not bring to the conversation. I'm now more interested in disrupting those types of deficit discourses, and I'm becoming more interested in learning what are the larger institutional structures at play that benefit from the social construct of English language learners. So Rochelle would call this the inability to predict. How can we envision a future where we will be able to give an assessment and not just shrug it off and have that expectation that English language learners will underperform relative to their non-ELL counterparts? So we know that these types of measures, they're not even representative of all student populations. And there's caveats in every one of these technical reports that says what we can and cannot do with these types of results. Yet that's not what happens. And we could think about what are the consequential decisions that we make with these trends. And so in addition to measurement error, I'll bring it back to Rochelle, who writes about gap gazing. And so that's a warning, because when we're gazing at gaps, we may be perpetuating harm of particular students, particular communities, through essentialization practices and objectification.
So here's an example of a question from the CAS, which is a California Science Test that just came out this year, a couple of weeks ago. And this is a 5th grade question. So the question says, students are making a model to show some cycles in a lake habitat. Their unfinished model is shown. So there's an image, pretty ducks, water, carbon dioxide, oxygen. The students want to show one way oxygen is added to the water. The students need to put an arrow on the diagram pointing from one source that produces oxygen. What is the source of oxygen? So it's like, okay, they look like simple sentences. But before they get to the question and be able to answer, now I'm thinking as a language learner, they have to read a full page of whatever background context is given to them before they can answer questions 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. And I'll pass this around.
I'll take it out.
And I can just connect back to when I came to the country as a 6th grader. This is 5th grade. I can tell you right now that when I was taking tests in Tijuana, it was a linear test. You don't skip questions, you don't go back, you go from one to the next to the next. And so when I look at this question, I would probably say, oh, well, I already read this and I can't go back. I'm not allowed to write on the test. So there's all of these other preconceptions that happen before you even step foot and try to take a standardized test.
And that leads me to think about the work of Guillermo Solano Flores or Sharon Nelson Barber, who write about issues like cultural and linguistic validity. So as Bill stated earlier, I studied at UC Santa Cruz, and UC Santa Cruz was the home of CREED. If you haven't heard of that center, it's the Center for Research on Education, on Equity, Diversity, and Excellence. They offered us 5 standards of effective instructional practices, and they also partner with CAL, the Center for Applied Linguistics, in creating national dual language standards and a forum. So CREED continued through many projects, 2 of which I was very blessed to participate in as a researcher. The first is the Estelle Project, Effective Science Teaching for English Language Learners, and the second is the ELISA Project, English Language and Literacy Integration in Subject Areas. And those subject areas were mathematics, science, and social studies. And building on the work from Estelle and ELISA, my colleagues and I developed the ALAS system, which stands for the Adolescent Literacy Assessment System, ALAS, which in Spanish translates to wings. And we created this for professional development context. This system offers teachers periodic formative assessment indicators of students' mathematics and science learning, as well as English language fluency and literacy simultaneously to inform teacher practices. This system involves various stages, but what I'd like to highlight about this work is that all of these stages are co-developed in partnership with teachers. So it's not we are the researchers, we're the experts model. It's let us learn about what you're doing in your professional community. How can we contribute? Here are some suggestions, never prescriptions, and let's construct a system that would make sense for you and your colleagues at a department level. So we offer a framework of assessment and teacher input creates that assessment. Whether it's in science or whether it's in mathematics, teachers co-select which prompt can provide the meaningful information. Then we co-analyze data and we create sessions of inter-rater reliability. We actually talk about this. Why are you seeing what I'm not seeing as researchers and as teachers? And then what does this mean for us as professional development folks in terms of the material and support systems that we're now accountable to provide you? And what does this mean for you as a practitioner in your practice? What are you going to integrate? What lessons learned are you going to integrate tomorrow, next week, next month, next unit? And so I think that instruments like this one, this is an example of a co-developed prompt that these folks at this particular Bay Area school in a middle school context developed. And one of the things that I think is important to note here is that they wanted to separate the mathematics into two dimensions, the reasoning and the computational. So teachers were already thinking about these two particular strands. And they also wanted to separate, well, what language, what vocabulary are they using? And they wanted to separate the language conventions of periods, spelling, and those issues. And so they had 3 waves of this, and then they just had that continuous improvement for some time. But this tool, I think, gives us some insight that it is possible to create lenses and frameworks and strategies and instruments that can separate between English language fluency and literacy and content area competence or proficiency. And so, moving on, we're going to talk now about how we've analyzed competence in science and mathematics respectively in our individual work.
Okay, so this is a study I conducted that looked at teacher perceptions, and I used the early childhood longitudinal study of 2011, so not the one from 98, and I created a composite variable based on these 7 items that it was actually part of the questionnaire for the teachers about the students, and we'll pass this around so you can see the statements if you're interested, which pretty much asks, is the child able to observe, make an observation? I believe that the teacher saw it 3 times and it was a yes. And the same thing with, can the child explain? So this is for a kinder level, the base year. And is the student able to classify? Can the student make a prediction? Is the child able to communicate? Do they understand physical science? Do they understand life science? So based on these, I created my composite variable to look at what I call science skill competence. Right, so all of this is teacher's perception. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the student is able to. That was not measured here. It was just part of what the teachers believed. So in doing that, I actually entered a total of 18 variables. So in thinking of the IEO model, I had 6 input variables like race, socioeconomic status, and other variables, and the 12 environmental variables had to do with the teacher in the classroom in the school setting. So was it a public or private school? Did the teacher have the right resources to work with English learner? That was one of the questions that I had access to from the data set. And so we can see here, there were only 9 significant variables. I took the betas and I put them in this little graph so that you can see above 0 what the positive predictors were, and then below 0 were the negative predictors. And the lowest one in red, students' language is not English. So in thinking about ideologies and the way the teachers were labeling the students, or like this is what came out of my study. And there's other studies that use the same data set that have similar findings. So I just want you to start thinking about, as we move forward to our discussion section, what does this mean? Okay, and there were other findings that I that I had, such as student is of Asian background, and that was a very high probability that the student was going to have a higher science skill competence level than students who were the not Hispanic, because Hispanic was my group that I used to, I forgot the word.
Your reference group.
My reference group, thank you, Dr. Santa Cruz. So.
To investigate mathematics competence, I'm going to tell you real briefly about a 6-year journey. So I analyzed restricted use data from the high school longitudinal study of 2009, and I wanted to answer 2 questions. 1, do teachers' instructional emphases and school context influence the standardized mathematics scores of Latinas and Latinos in U.S. high schools? And then, does the relationship between teachers' instructional emphases, school context, and mathematics achievement differ for Latinas and Latinos of different degrees of English language fluency and literacy? So, the initial draw was 25,000 students. It's a national sample. The outcome variable was 11th grade mathematics achievement, taken in the spring semester of 2012. This study does control for prior achievement. The 9th grade assessment, which was taken in spring 2010. The achievement measure is an algebraic reasoning assessment developed by the American Institutes for Research that included 73 items related to algebraic content and processes. To move this work forward, one of the strategies I used was principal components analyses. I used PCA because I wanted to investigate. Here I am at Santa Cruz. Everyone is talking about this notion of conceptual understanding. Conceptual understanding should be a distinctive construct than procedural fluency in this data set using this particular survey. So we have some copies, I think we have extras of the actual survey that teachers were provided, and it asks, think about the full duration of your course. How much emphasis do you place on each of the following objectives? Increasing students' interest in mathematics, teaching students mathematical concepts, teaching students algorithms and procedures, and so on. And so we should be looking at 2 very particular strands, and this principal component analysis did confirm that. So the result of that is that there were 2 factors, if you will, the conceptual and the procedural, that met the standard criteria for composite construction. 3 prior variables loaded onto each component. They share distinctive conceptual meanings, and rotative factor patterns have high loadings on one component, but very low loadings on the other. And this composite construct of conceptual was then extended to create a counterfactual comparison group. So for students, Latina and Latino students that had teachers who showed high alignment with this particular conceptual identity emphasis, were created as a treatment group, if you will. So divided all the teachers based on their conceptual rating into quartiles. Only the top quartile, 75% and higher, were treated as the comparison, as the treatment group, and everyone else was treated as the comparison group. So to do that with observational data and create this quasi-experimental technique, I used propensity score matching. And through propensity score matching, the finding and the takeaway is that when students, Latino students in high school, have access to teachers who self-report these high incidences of conceptual emphasis, their test scores are improved. Their test scores, there is an impact. This can be in a strong associative way, not quasi-experimental, not experimental. We don't know beyond just the observed covariates, but we can say in a very strong associative way that when teachers privilege these particular practices to a high extent, there is improvement on their test scores at 11th grade. So as researchers, we see the importance of individuals and institutional values, even when interpreting quantitative results. And I bring this up because, so if there's impact, what's the magnitude? It depends on who you ask. The magnitude estimate is going to be different if we're working with What Works Clearinghouse, if we're working with Hattie's concept, so it depends. So I want to be clear that when we're talking about magnitude, that issue at an institutional level, which is what most interests me now, what is the institutional identity's frame of what counts? What's magnitude? And then we can go from there. But let's start wrapping it up.
So for our conclusions, and we showed you earlier the areas that we were covering for the presentation. So in terms of access and assessment, with instructional alignment, we talk about formative and summative assessments are inseparable from instructional practice. Right?
And what kinds of questions you ask are really informed by your ideological values. Do you ask diversity questions about counts? Or do you ask social justice and equity questions about what's appropriate and who's excluded and who's more marginalized than others? That influences the way you do the work. And I just want to finish with, who's profiting from this construct of English language learners? And how? And how do we, as researchers in this work, hold ourselves accountable to our students, to our participants, to our communities, in terms of our own competence with working with multicultural students? What are our instruments and tools? And that's really the takeaway that I'd like to finalize with as we wrap this up and share that we're doing this work in a bilingual context. Can you share a little bit about where we learned this from?
Dr. Alfaro is teaching a class this semester on publishing through the angle of writing with a critical lens. And she invited Dr. Antonia Darder to give a talk to her students, and it was actually a workshop on a Saturday. We were very lucky to have her for about 8 hours. And there's a presentation, there was a hands-on activity, there was dialogue, there was questions. And so we had a chance to hear from her and her current work. And this was one of her slides that we wanted to bring and share with you. So, question is, how do we prepare bilingual educators to teach mathematics and science? And go ahead.
Yeah, and the takeaway is ideology is just one aspect from that conversation, that institute, and dialogue is another. And we don't want to walk away from this space leaving you all with this one and done model. That's not the way we do the work. We do the work in a dialogical way, and we want to invite you to be a part of this work. And we want to have some guiding questions for you and your colleagues to discuss some of the next steps. Because we've learned from professional development that unless you do this in a continuous way, if you don't take these types of conversations into your next meeting, to your next classroom on Monday, as you're preparing your lesson on Sunday night for the week, if you're not bringing these questions to those spaces, then everything we did today is for naught. So we'd like you to use the document in front of you as a guide to start dialogue with one another, because we're leaving this space, but many of you work closely on projects and course design, and so we're hoping that you all will take this opportunity to engage with one another and use us as invited guests to your conversation. And with that, I'll ask my colleague to please turn off the